All right, hey you guys, welcome to today's video. We have a lot to cover in a fantastic monitor, in my opinion, that we're going to be talking about. And of course, it is the Acer Nitro XV271Z. And this guy packs a punch, let me tell you. It's 280 hertz of pure goodness and buttery smooth motion. So we're going to be breaking down all of the internals, the hardware, the performance, and everything you need to know before you buy this monitor in today's video. So I recently just put out a video telling you guys the 5 things to avoid in gaming monitors. And I did mention high refresh rate, but I do want to tell you, if you're looking at this monitor, you should seriously consider it if you have headroom in your graphics card. And we will be exploring those settings in about 5 different games today to see how well my 3090 and this monitor pair up together to be able to give you that 280 hertz of goodness, which leads me to, of course, talk to you guys about specs. This guy here is an IPS display. It's a 0.5 or as low as 0.5 millisecond response rate. It, of course, is an HDR400 AMD FreeSync Premium panel from Acer Nitro. It does have an overclock mode that allows you to get to that 280 hertz, which we will be exploring later in the video. And don't be disappointed by the 1920 by 1080p resolution. It's more than enough pixel density for you to enjoy the gaming, especially considering it is HDR400, which we already talked about. A couple notable mentions would be the fact that this guy does have full height adjustment. It does rotate on the desk. It has cable management along the back. It has a tilt adjustment, and of course it does go into that portrait mode when you give it a rotation. The only downside I've seen so far within the unboxing is the fact that it only has 2 HDMIs and 1 display port with, of course, your headphone jack. But I think that's more than enough to get you off the ground and into gaming. So let's jump into the menus and setup and see how easy this thing calibrates, what it looks like out of the box, and what we have to do to get all of these features unlocked. So first off, I'll put the calibration below for you guys to check out. This was my own personal calibration and it worked great. First, I went into user and then I maxed out the brightness and set the contrast to 53, the black boost to 5, and then something that I noticed was without max brightness on, it was actually very low contrast. And with this being a 400 peak nit brightness monitor, it should have a great contrast level and great brightness. But going through the different presets, there's quite a few, there's 8 of them. And the only one I could find that came close to the user settings that I had was HDR performance, which of course is going to change around some of the settings that I have internally as far as pixel response rate and VRR technology. Now, something I had to do out of the box, of course, was turn on the AMD FreeSync Premium because it was off when I plugged in the display. But it did lead me to discover that this is a G-Sync compatible monitor. So even if you're an NVIDIA user or AMD alike, then you can get this monitor and enjoy VRR through and through. Now, moving on within the menus and setup here, we run into a setting called VRB, and that's Visual Response Boost. And that's kind of like ELMB sync. We talked about it in that video that I discussed with you, the one where I told you the 5 things to stay away from. Now, I tested it out a little bit on this display, not a lot, but I don't believe in these sort of settings all the way. Maybe there's a scenario where they make sense, but I've never found one. So just leave that VRB off and I think you'll be happy. The last thing I'll say about the menus here is that they're pretty in-depth. There's quite a bit of calibration you can do. It's not as in-depth as, say, the Gigabyte M28U or the LG GP850, but it does leave a lot for you to be able to control your display the way you want. It even does have HDMI black level adjustment, so if you're using an HDMI source like a console, you're gonna get some extra calibration out of that. And that's fantastic in today's day and age. So let's jump into the panel test here with ISO monitor test. And I just do a uniformity test and make sure my pixels aren't dead. And of course, I went through your regular gamut of colors just to make sure, but I wanted to stop on this gray uniformity test. The panel's doing fairly well on the gray uniformity. It's not perfect, so this lighting panel isn't exactly reaching every area equally, but there is a bit we can do to correct here, and we'll get into that later. Going through those color tests, test, I didn't actually notice any dead pixels whatsoever, so the QC on this monitor is fantastic. There's plenty more I could say about the menus and setup, but I will say this was above par, and I was happy with what Acer gave us with this monitor. So I want to move into the Blur Busters test, and what I did was went into that menu, and I did the overclock mode up to 280 hertz because I want to get the full scope of what this guy is capable of in this test. So of course this next one is all about refresh rate. And slowing it down to about 50% speed here, what I see is, nothing bad. The pixel response rate is on their normal setting. It's not on super fast to get that 0.5 milliseconds, but we're probably somewhere between 1 millisecond, 2 millisecond here. And even as I pause, we're getting a teeny bit of overshoot on that top frame, but the bottom 2 frames are looking fantastic. And to the naked eye, the only thing that I can see stutter in is that bottom frame. So a little bit of back and forth stutter, but it's not terrible. Now, this test says everything I needed to know. This is the world motion blur test here on Blur Busters. And wow, you guys, I'm just gonna play this for you and go ahead and see, tell me what you see. What I see is this bottom world motion blur test just smooth as ever. I mean, extremely smooth. While that lower frames per second, that 30 frames per second on the top is just skipping along. But even as the speed picks up, this thing, oh my gosh, you guys, it is just buttery smooth. I can even pause on that fast motion, and this monitor is displaying accurately all the information along this world motion blur test. It's probably the best response to this test that I've seen on a monitor, bar none. Now, I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves here because we still have a lot more to test. Especially gaming, real world gaming. That's where we want to see the true performance in. But up next, I do have the pixel response rate test where I go from low, medium to high pixel response rates to see what kind of performance we get with this monitor. So let's jump in, starting with off. Now that pixel response rate being off is kind of doing what's expected here, and it's giving a bit of ghosting, that double image where you see the ghosted image behind it. But that's what I would expect, given that it's just kind of doing what the panel naturally does. Now with normal, it's a little bit better. We do have a teeny bit of ghosting on that top level. The mid level is looking fantastic, as well as that bottom level. So low and medium frames per second are actually doing fairly well with this regular setting. You can expect that. So if you're running like, 120 hertz to 180 hertz, you're probably better off on the normal setting, at least based on this. And if you're at that high 280 hertz, it's not going to be bad, but you may see a bit of that trailing ghost in your gameplay. But we're going to test out the extreme, which is, like they say, as low as 0.5 millisecond response rate. So getting into the extreme here, what we notice on this level refresh rate is there is some overshoot. And depending on where I pause it, we're actually getting a teeny bit of ghosting as well. But again, I am capturing at a lower frame rate. And if we look at this just with the naked eye as it pans along, we're actually seeing a very smooth picture, very smooth display, and we're not seeing a lot of trace elements in ghosting happening here. We're getting a good refresh, but it does lack that ultimate experience, which is where I would probably tell you that the normal setting here is my recommended setting through and through, whether you have low, medium, or high frames per second in your gameplay. I think that's where you're going to get your best performance, and in fact that's what this test shows us here. But we're going to test that out a little bit further into the gameplay section here. So let's get into Borderlands. Well, jumping into Borderlands 3 gameplay actually proved to be quite nice. The contrast and the color was actually pretty good, and I wasn't receiving any poor performance as far as stutter and lag. So the variable refresh rate paired up with NVIDIA G-Sync works really well. I tested with it off and it was pretty poor. So there is a good disparity between not using it and utilizing it, which is to be expected. Now, I want to point out a couple things here. On a game like Borderlands 3, where it's very graphically advanced, you're not actually going to be utilizing the full potential of this monitor because you're only going to be receiving the frames that your GPU can handle. And even at medium settings here, I'm getting about 140, 130 frames per second, and there's a bit of ghosting going on. The picture quality is great. The detail, the fidelity that I get off this 1080p monitor far exceeded my expectations. it beats out the Samsung G3 and of course the HP 25X, in which it should. It's about double the price. But moving on, I want to talk about a game where you can actually get the full potential of that 240 to 280 hertz capability, and that's Valorant. And I actually turned the settings down just a little bit so they're not maxed out. And what we see here is I'm pretty much getting a locked 200 frames per second, which means I could probably turn that fidelity all the way down to the lowest settings and get 240 hertz capability. And the actual graphics aren't terrible here. I mean, I'm not really seeing any artifacting on the walls here. You can see the brick pattern in the actual wall, and it looks normal. It doesn't look bad whatsoever. And everywhere I pause along this game, I'm not seeing any ghosting, I'm not seeing any motion blur. 240 hertz wasn't the only benefit I got here in this game. That IPS color really popped in a game like this, where you have those graphics and that high vibrancy in color, those neon greens and blues and purples. It looked fantastic, and if this is your style of gameplay, by all means, get this monitor if you want. Well, next up is Warzone, and you'd think with a graphics card like the 3090, you'd be just sunshining all day with beautiful graphics in a game like Warzone and max out those frames per second to be able to give yourself that buttery smooth 240 hertz capability. Well, I did actually crank it up to 280 hertz, and I tried to eke out the most performance I possibly could for fidelity and frames per second on a balanced scale. And the most I could really come up with was about 150 frames per second. With that said, I kind of strapped into my seat here and played a few rounds, and this is what I found. Sitting at 144 hertz, I'm actually aiming down sights at quite a few different opponents here, moving fast, taking quick turns, ducking, dodging, dipping, and dodging. Name that movie line. By the way, it's looking fantastic. Of course, I could get the same performance on 144 hertz though, so that leads me to tell you that Warzone probably isn't the best game to be utilizing this monitor on. Things like Valorant did much better because you're getting that full capacity, that full frame rate. I would buy the monitor just to have the headroom. I have other 144 hertz monitors that don't perform as well as this. However, I have reviewed 165 hertz and 180 hertz monitors that perform just as well. Now, this is a particular area where the monitor's brightness actually didn't benefit me, and it's when I was looking up into the sky at my opponent here. Now, the camera is actually on a pretty low setting as far as brightness, so I know that it's mostly the display that's causing issues here. And what you can see is the opponent here, the guy in the sky, is actually washed out. I can't make out his character, and that can be a bit unfortunate if you play games that are a bit brighter. However, it can come in handy probably as far as brightness goes if you're playing darker games. Now, I did find an area that I wasn't sure if I was really satisfied with, and it had to do with this long range shot. I've got my Krig out, and long range, it's actually a fantastic weapon for that. What I do is I aim down sights, and I'm aiming at this guy next to the truck, and as he's moving around, it's becoming harder and harder to actually make out the outline and the full body of his character. I'm almost losing him in the texture of the map and the other objects that are near him. So I think in contrast performance, it's not quite doing its best at its max brightness setting. And maybe if I turn that max brightness off, this would probably perform better in this scenario. But that then leaves me with performance in other areas lacking. So I don't know if I'm satisfied with that. I would almost count this as a neutral point, leaning more towards a point against this monitor. Now, I've become somewhat of a maniac when it comes to this next game, and that's Back 4 Blood. I downloaded it recently, and this being an HDR monitor and having that 240 hertz, 280 hertz performance, I knew that I could pull those settings down and get just maximum performance motion capability wise while getting the best color out of this monitor. And I have to tell you that I was actually quite shocked with what I found. I mean, look at some of these blowouts, man. Oh yeah, woo, look at that, man. Pausing on that bad boy, the color, the fidelity, the graphics are looking fantastic. And I'm at a locked like 220 to 250 hertz. I mean, wow, this is a game where you can take full advantage of this display. The graphics inherently are fantastic. You don't have to max out the settings to put a lot of stress on your GPU, and you can get buttery smooth motion while getting fantastic color. I just have to tell you, that's why I fell in love with this game, because not only is it extremely graphically cool, but it's not hard to play whatsoever. Now, the last thing I'll say here about this monitor, and it goes back to the contrast issue we had in Warzone, is what we see here in this very dark game is it's actually crushing a lot of detail in the black areas here. We're not able to make out the character extremely well, and that again goes back to that overall contrast. What we run into is in our very bright areas and our very dark areas, it's graphically challenged. It doesn't do as good of a job as you would like it to. Now, there's a bit of a sweet spot, and that sweet spot is great, but anything outside of that sweet spot can be a bit of a challenge. I enjoyed the game though, enough so that I actually left this up for like a week after I did all this B-roll, and I kept playing on this monitor, and I had a great time. So I'm not giving it any bad review here as far as its capability. I'm just pointing out some things that I noticed that might help you in your buying decision. Now, the true test of color here, in my opinion, is on a game like this, Metro Exodus Enhanced RTX version. And this is a game where I love to test HDR side by side and see how the monitor reacts. And that's exactly what we do. So in this intro scene, we're actually not in HDR, and it's able to really give us some good detail in those white areas. It's not blowing out the picture like we saw in previous games. So maybe in story mode games where the graphics are more detail oriented and they're actually calibrated for HDR, you're gonna get better experiences through and through. And that's what this game is showing me right now. So I want to mention I'm not testing this game for overall motion capability. This is color, contrast, HDR test. And what we see is with HDR on, it's looking like some of the other displays we've seen in the past. It's giving us great clarity. The ray tracing looks fantastic. As we make those moves and we pan around the sky, we're seeing those light rays just kind of reflect and shine off of things and move with our movement and not be one-dimensional. And the clouds have a good gray color to them. So I pan back over to the sun here, and I'm gonna switch to HDR off to be able to see what the difference is in this exact point. Wow. I mean, that's a massive difference, you guys. Just like we saw with other monitors, when you have this bright light in non-HDR on, what it's not able to do is give you a good gradient of color to choose from. Of course, the only drawback I'll mention here is the fact that it's not as bright as standard dynamic range. But that's not really a bad thing, because I would rather have more depth in color and a higher contrast ratio than I would a brighter display. So that really leads me to say, with Metro Exodus and the HDR performance, I think it's done a fantastic job, and the HDR does actually make a difference on this monitor. If you are going to get a high refresh rate monitor, I'd prefer, or at least recommend, that you get something that is HDR. That way, when you run into those games that have just higher fidelity like Metro Exodus, and you still want to get good performance out of your monitor, you're not stuck buying a secondary monitor or just trashing it all together. So I could go on and on about the performance of this monitor, but I'm not going to do that because I think we've seen enough and we're going to move on. But before we do, I want to let you know we have a fantastic channel built out for you with lots of playlists for you to be able to check out. Tons on different monitors that I've reviewed, both for PC gaming using AMD and NVIDIA, and of course, console gaming. So go check out that homepage. Definitely hit like if you made it this far in the video, and subscribe to the channel. More and more of you are subscribing, and I appreciate you for that, because that's what keeps us going. So without further ado, let's wrap up this video, and we're first gonna start by talking about the 3 downsides of this monitor. So I'm going to start with the most obvious downside, and that is contrast. As we saw in Warzone and Back 4 Blood, in those bright areas, it was blowing out the detail. And in the dark areas in Back 4 Blood, it was crushing the detail. There was nothing to be seen there, and that, for me, is kind of a disappointment. And the second downside is going to be gray uniformity. Kind of ties in with the first. And we did that gray uniformity test, and what we saw was quite a bit of IPS glow. While I didn't actually see that in every single game, it is a good test to tell me how well this responds in scenarios where lighting plays a factor. And in my opinion, it scored pretty poorly in gray uniformity. Now the third is probably the biggest upset when you see this branding on the monitor itself, and they claim that it has as low as a 0.5 millisecond response rate. But we tested that extreme on the Blur Busters and we didn't see a good result. So much so that I ran it in normal setting all the time. I actually never put it in extreme because I didn't trust it would give me the performance that I wanted. So enough with my complaints, let's get on to the good stuff, you guys. That's why you're here. You want to know where this monitor shines. And the first I have to say is that 240 hertz plus performance. In every game that I was able to get 200 plus and even 144 plus, the motion capability was fantastic. Now the second upside is reinforced if we look back at the Metro Exodus gameplay and Valorant gameplay. The color was actually very good. It's very accurate. Same with Borderlands. We had good saturation. It wasn't oversaturated. It didn't have a weird hue to it in these games, which means out of the box with its presets and some normal calibration done, it's going to suit pretty much any game as far as the color capability goes. And then when we tested the HDR in Metro Exodus, we saw that big performance gain in overall color range. And the last, but probably the most important benefit for you watching is going to be price for the features that you get. For 240 hertz plus, for the good HDR 400 certification, as well as the aesthetics. I mean, this thing is sweet on the desk. I love the stand it's on and the fact that it rotates, it turns. You can put it in portrait mode. Those are all fantastic features that I wouldn't expect to be on this class of monitor, sub $400. And at the time of making this video, it's actually on sale for $340, which leads me to say that at $340, it's actually a heck of a bargain and takes a lot of those negatives and kind of tells me, hey, I'm willing to deal with those. In fact, I could probably calibrate some of them out for my regular everyday gameplay and be fully satisfied. But there is an asterisk there, and it's the fact that 280 hertz is not easy to hit on most of your games. So if what you're looking for is just a very smooth gameplay with high refresh rate, I tell you to go check out the GP850, the GP83, the MSI Artemis 323 CQR, and some of the other monitors that I've tested on the channel. So you have to think about the trade-offs that you make when you go 1080 high refresh rate and 1440p fairly high refresh rate. And that's where I'm going to leave that to you. Is this a monitor I would recommend? I would say for me, it's a monitor I would buy, because I have something like a 3090 and because I can take advantage of HDR in the games that I play. But not everybody will have that same capability, and I fully understand that. So the decision is on you. Well, that wraps up the video for today, you guys. I appreciate you guys that made it this far. Go check out some of the other playlists that we have on the channel. I've got one that's just about to pop up here as we end the video. It's going to be all related to monitors that I've reviewed, and I list them out pretty well for you guys to be able to check out depending on what you're looking for. 1080p, 1440p, 4K, all of the above is there. So go click that playlist and I'll catch you in the next video.